Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Ron's Amazing Stories, where we play tales to take you away from today.
So, Ron, what do we have on the show this time?
I'm glad you asked, British guy. On the show today, we play the conclusion to Moonweed.
Cool, man.
Not that kind of weed.
Bummer.
We read a story from Price, Utah that warns antiquers, beware.
No way.
It's true. And Tom has another growing up memory to wind up the show.
I am guessing there is a 5-minute mystery.
There is, and it begins now.
Another 5-minute mystery.
This 5-minute mystery is being brought to you by foreshadowing. Foreshadowing occurs in a literary text when the author gives clues and hints about what is to come within a story. Now, why would I tell you this at the start of one of our mysteries? Come on now, you're smarter than that.
Steady. Gotta hold my arm still.
Bullseye, Sergeant.
Yeah. It's a mighty fine revolver you have here, Captain.
I picked it up for a song in a pawn shop yesterday.
Here, load her up and let's see your aim.
It's really a sweet job.
It is a nice gun, Captain. Only trouble is I'm lazy. I don't like a revolver. You have to go to all the trouble of picking the used shells out and reloading. Personally, give me an automatic. Just slip a clip in and...
Captain Jenkins, you're wanted upstairs immediately. A report has just come in over the radio of a shooting on the west side.
There goes our target practice.
Come along, Sergeant. We'll drive out and see what gives. You say your husband was sitting here by the open window when you heard the shot, Mrs. Williams.
That's right. I was in the kitchen. I came running in just in time to see Ben slumping down in the chair and some man running down towards the river there.
Sergeant, take a look outside the window for footprints.
Right at it.
Did you get a good look at the man, Mrs. Williams?
No, I didn't, Captain. He was too far away and running.
Well, why should anyone want to kill your husband?
Oh, he's quite wealthy, Captain, and, well, perhaps he's been a bit ruthless in his business dealings. He's made enemies, especially among the people in the tenements he owns.
No luck, Captain. Not a sign of a footprint.
Well, I didn't expect you'd find any. You see, Mr. Williams has powder burns on the right cheek where the bullet entered.
Well, I'll be... He was a suicide, then.
Mrs. Williams, there's no use in your lying. Where's the gun?
Gun? Why, there's no... All right. It's in the closet at the basement stairs. But I only put
I'll get it.
I didn't mean to do anything wrong, Captain. It's only...
I think I understand.
I didn't want any publicity to get out that Ben had committed suicide. It wouldn't be good.
Well, just what did happen now?
When I heard the shot and came in from the kitchen, I saw what Ben had done. The gun was still in his right hand. I gently removed the gun and put it in the closet. Then I made up the story of seeing the man running.
You didn't do anything else? Didn't touch the gun in any other way? Or didn't change anything about your husband?
Oh, no.
Here's the gun, Captain. Small caliber revolver. One cartridge missing from the chamber.
Where's the missing cartridge, Mrs. Williams?
I threw it into the furnace. It was lying on the floor beneath Ben's hand. Oh, I've made such a blunder of things.
I'll say you have, Mrs. Williams. You've blundered yourself right into a murder charge. In just a moment, we shall return for the solution to our mystery. In the meantime...
Okay, we actually have the answer. She picked up the shell from the floor, but how did it get there? Perhaps there was a clue in the foreshadowing experience at the gun range? Nah, can't be that simple. A motive could be that she caught her husband at the gun range with another shooter. Let's go see.
And now, back to our story. Yes, Mrs. Williams, you blundered on every move, but especially when you stated you had picked the cartridges off the floor from under Ben's hand. You couldn't have picked the cartridges off the floor, as a revolver doesn't eject its cartridges. If your husband had committed suicide, he couldn't have removed it. But you did, and threw it in the furnace as part of the plan. I wonder what story you'll cook up for the jury.
How How about that? More foreshadowing about the trial. Or maybe the lieutenant was just being literal and wonders if Mrs. Williams is going to do some baking for the jury. I'll look for a continuation of this story, but I'm guessing I'm going to come up empty. This 5-Minute Mystery was brought to you by Foreshadowing. It has its place in any good tale. I received this email from Harry Ball, who writes to us from Fort Apache, Arizona. Now, you know I had to look that one up. Fort Apache is an unincorporated community in Navajo County, Arizona. The town is on Fort Apache Indian Reservation and has a post office with the zip code 85926. As of the census of 2010, there are 143 people, 46 households, and 36 families residing in Fort Apache. How about that? Now, Harry writes, "Hello, Ron. I can't say I like your podcast because I love it. So many things in an hour, and I can't get enough of your show. In fact, I am now working through your archives and noticed that you've come a very long way since those early years. I have a simple question for you. Why?" Harry Ball, Fort Apache, Arizona. Well, maybe not so simple, Harry. Why? A very good question. In all the years that I have done this show, no one has ever asked it, so it's kinda open to interpretation. I have decided not to script an answer and just talk for a minute. Why this podcast, or rather, why? Well, when I first started the podcast, the idea was that I was going to promote myself. Get myself to a situation where I was going to be able to expand my business and use the podcast to get people involved. Well, little did I know that you guys had other ideas. I tell my writers all the time, you cannot tell a story. A story has a life of its own, and it's going to tell itself. You just have to be willing to listen to what it has to tell you. It's going to take you over and it's going to say, hey, wow, this is where I want to go. Your characters are going to come to life and they are going to guide where your story goes. I hear it again and again from every author I've had on the show that all they had to do was listen. Well, I think that applies to this podcast as well, because if I had followed through with what I wanted to do, I would have another podcast where authors come on and hawk their books. Well, as you can see, my podcast doesn't do that. My podcast tells your stories, and I'm so happy about that, and it means the world to me to be able to do it every week. I just wish everybody on the planet could hear the podcast and hear the stories that you guys have and that we put out together. So, Harry, why do I do this? That's why. So that I can tell stories that people either haven't heard for a very long time, or let you rather tell your story for us to hear. There you go. Why? I hope that answers your question, Harry. At least, I hope it made some sense. Thank you for sending it in. And now, this message from Gladys Goodies.
I'm Gladdy, the dachshund, the face of Gladdy's Goodies. Are you worried about your pet's health? My parents were too, especially since I developed pancreatitis. They couldn't find any treats I could eat, so they made some. Our natural treats are healthy for all dogs, with and without health issues. We have lots of delicious flavors like chicken, turkey, salmon, sweet potato, beef, and more. With our homemade treats, you won't worry about the contents because they have no chemicals, fillers, or bad ingredients. Go to GladysGoodies.com now to get your fur friend a bag and pick them up some swag while you're there. You'll be glad you did. Remember, we have the treats and swag to make their tails wag. Again, that's GladysGoodies.com. Again, that's GladysGoodies.com.
Now don't forget to use our very own promo code RONS to get a 20% discount on all of your purchases. That is RONS. Thank you, Gladdy. And now, here are your stories.
These are your stories, sent by you, for you.
This week we have a story for you that should curl your toes. It comes from Earl Patrick Ross. Earl sent this in via the website from Price, Utah. He calls this story The Hazards of Antiquing. Hello, Ron. I have a story that happened to me this last fall. I am an antique dealer and I'm constantly on the look for things to add to my shop. The hard part about being a dealer is that you have to sell the things that you find. I guess part of the thrill is the finding, but when I do get something new, I tend to fall in love with it. My wife and I have a house full of things that we just could not part with. However, there was this one time we wish we had. That is what this story is about. Antiquing in Utah is a hit-or-miss thing. For the best stuff, you have to go to the rural cities and speak to the folks that don't have much use for newfangled stuff. The problem is that they're not generally willing to part with their treasures. This one time, though, the family could not sell it to us fast enough. Perhaps that should have been our cue to just say no. But the price was amazing. The object of our desire? An ornate door that I dated to be at least 200 years old. The family said their father brought the old door home after finding it in a pile of debris from a recently demolished house. That's all that they would tell us. I asked many questions, but they could not, or perhaps would not, tell us more than that. The door was in great condition, and I thought it would make a good addition to our house since we were in the midst of renovating the second floor. I used it to close off the guest room from the upstairs hallway. This was the last thing we needed to complete the project. The night after we hung that strange door, weird things began to happen. Now, I should point out that there is a crawl space that runs behind both the guest room and our bedroom. At around 3 a.m., we both were awoken by a loud pounding coming from the crawl space. We jumped out of bed and ran into the guest room with a flashlight and removed the access panel. We were petrified, but when I shone the light inside the crawl space, we saw nothing. I was even brave enough to enter the crawl space, but didn't find anything out of place. Reasoning that the noise might have been caused by an outside tree branch hitting the house, we replaced the access panel and went back to bed. A half hour later, the fierce pounding began again. This time Connie, my wife, even checked outside while I went back into the crawl space. Neither of us could find anything that could cause that noise. I don't mind telling you that we were both pretty scared, and for the next week, every night at 3 a.m., the pounding would be repeated. We were getting exhausted. On the 7th night, we were lying awake waiting for the pounding to start. 3 o'clock came, but no pounding. At last, I said, "It's over." Then the door to our bedroom flew open, and a wild wind rushed into the room. It was crazy, and it made no sense. It grew cold, and I remember shivering. Then Connie screamed. A voice had come out of nowhere, and I swear it said, "I want my door." Things immediately fell silent. The next morning, I removed that old door and took it down to the shop. A few strange things happened there, but that all stopped the day an old couple bought it and took it away. The pounding? Well, that never returned, and I have never bought an antique door again. Earl Patrick Ross, Price, Utah. What an amazing story, Earl. It gave me chills as I read it, and I had trouble doing that. Thank you for sharing it, and I'm happy that your life returned to normal. I've heard of haunted items before, but nothing quite like that. Our featured story is called The Moonweed. It first appeared in Astounding Stories number 20 from August of 1931. Now, when I listened to this one, I could not help myself from being taken in and taken away to another time. This week, we will hear the conclusion to it, and I think you're going to find it pretty exciting. In part 1, we met Carl Vanderventer, Van for short, who is a scientist that has figured out a way to extract items from the moon using ray beams. Now he unwittingly brings back seed pods as well and unleashes an army of plant beasts on the world. Now he fights for Earth's very survival and against the tightening web of voracious carnivorous plants that seemingly can't be killed. What you're about to hear is the conclusion to our tale. It is titled Moonweed by Harl Vincent and is read for us by friend to the podcast, Mark Nelson. Take it away, Mark.
Governor Perkins met them in person when they arrived at the municipal airport in Albany. A great crowd had gathered in the shadows outside in the brilliance of the floodlights, and a police escort rushed them to the governor's private car. "Here's where you go to the Bastille for socking that cop," Van observed. His spirits had risen appreciably since that successful SOS call. But the governor was in a serious mood as they made their way toward the executive mansion through the milling crowds that lined the hilly streets of the capital city of New York State. Proofs had not been lacking of the truth of Bill Peterson's radio warning. Already, the spreading Red Death had covered a circle some 8 miles in diameter, covering farmlands and destroying the crops, blocking the roads and trapping many on the streets and in their homes and in nearby towns. More than 100 had lost their lives, and thousands were fleeing the threatened area. The country was in an uproar. "Gentlemen," the governor said when they had reached the privacy of his chambers, "this is a serious matter, and no time must be lost in dealing with it. Nevertheless, I want you, Mr. Vanderventer, to tell your story of the thing to me and to the radio system of the United States Secret Service. The President himself will be listening, as will the chief executives of most of the states. Hold nothing back, as the fate of our people is at stake." So Van faced the microphone and related the history of his work in the little laboratory in the Ramapo Mountains. He told of his interest in the Earth satellite, and of his first unsuccessful experiments with ultra-telescopes in the endeavor to explore its surface close at hand, of the failure of a spaceship he had built, of the final discovery of the ray, by means of which it was possible to transport solid objects from the one body to the other. He told of the discovery of man-made relics and of fossils. He told of the diamonds, and of the attack by Dan Kelly, which had resulted in the spreading of the seed of the deadly moonweed. He even related the incident of the traffic policeman, at which the governor smiled. "That has been reported," he said, "and you need have no fear on that score. The charges will be dropped. I now ask that you give us your opinion as to the best method of combating this new enemy. Have you any ideas?" "I have not, sir," Van replied gloomily, "though I believe it can be done only from the air. Possibly bombing, or a gas of some sort. I don't know. It will take time, Mr. Governor." "Yes, and meanwhile the thing is overwhelming us at what rate?" "As nearly as I can estimate it, the growth is moving with a speed of 4 or 5 miles an hour. By morning, you can expect it will have traveled 40 or 50 miles in all directions?" I'm afraid so." A sharp buzz from the instrument on the governor's desk interrupted them. "The President," he whispered. "That is enough, Governor," came the husky tones of President Alford's voice. "I shall communicate with Secretary Makeley at once. All available Army bombing planes will be rushed to the scene. You, sir, will mobilize the militia, as will the governors of the other states. Meanwhile, this young scientist is to report to the Bureau of Scientific Research in Washington tonight. Have him bring a supply of these seeds with him." That was all. Governor Perkins offered no comment, but merely rose from his seat to indicate that the discussion was ended. A solemn silence reigned in the room. "Let's go!" exclaimed Bill Peterson suddenly, unawed by the presence of the governor. "My ship's waiting, and we can stop off for a couple of those pods and still make Washington in 2 hours. Come on!" Governor Perkins smiled. "Good luck, boys," he said as they were ushered from the room. "My car will return you to the airport. And remember, the country will be watching you now and expecting much from you. Goodbye." They were to recall his words in the dark days ahead. Before they had reached Newburgh, they saw a dull red glow in the skies that told them the news broadcast to which they had been listening had not exaggerated. The red growth was luminous in darkness. Off there to the southwest, it was as if a vast forest fire were lighting the heavens. No wonder the panics and rioting were getting out of control of the police. Coming up over Bear Mountain, they caught their first glimpse of the sea of fire that was the Red Death by night. Like a vast bed of glowing embers, it covered the countryside, extending eastward to Haverstraw, where it was temporarily halted by the broad Hudson. It was a shimmering, undulating mass of living, luminous things, eating their horrible way through all organic matter that stood in their path. Writhing, squirming, all-absorbing monsters that sent out an advance guard of independent snake-like tendrils to capture and hold for the lagging mother plants whatever of livestock and humanity they were able to find. "Think they'll get over the river, Van?" Bart asked. "Sure they will. Every fugitive who had a narrow escape after being in contact with these things is a potential carrier of the seed. I found several of them sticking to my clothing after we got away. I picked a couple off your coat, but didn't tell you." "Lord, what did you do with them?" "Put them in the ash receiver in my car, like a fool. Wouldn't have to go down for more if I'd kept them." "Well, it can't be helped now. We'll have a job getting some down there now, too." "I'll say so." Van lapsed into gloomy silence. They were over the landing field above Tompkins Cove, and Bill turned on the siren, whose raucous shriek operated the mechanism of the floodlight switches by sound vibrations. The field sprang into instant illumination, and they circled it once before swooping to a landing. They were but a mile from the advancing terror. The field was deserted, and the three men started off immediately in the direction of the oncoming weed. "We'll have to make it snappy," Van grunted. "We've got about 12 minutes to get the pods and get back to the ship. The damn things will be here by that time." They scrambled over fences and pushed through thickets. The lighted windows of a deserted farmhouse were directly ahead, and they ran through the open gate and across the fields. Ever, the glow of the weed grew brighter. A terrified horse galloped wildly past them and crashed into the fence, whinnying piteously as it went down with a broken leg. They could see the red rim of the advancing horror just beyond the road. One of the detached tendrils slithered past, each glowing coil distinctly visible. "Lucky the things can't see," Bart shuddered. "Yeah," said Van. "Have to dodge 'em to get in close enough to one of the plants. Keep your eyes peeled now, you fellows, in case one of us gets caught." A terrific explosion rocked the ground. They had paid no heed to the roaring of motors overhead. The bombers were on the job. Shooting skyward, a column of flame not 100 yards from them showed where the high explosive had landed in the red mass. Then slimy, wriggling things rained all about them, fragments of the red weed that still squirmed and crawled and clung. Bill Peterson yelled and clutched at his neck where one of the things had taken hold. Another warning whistle of a falling bomb. Crash. More of the horror raining down and splattering as it fell. Whistle, crash. A huge blob of quivering, luminous jelly fell before them, a portion of one of the mother plants. Crash! Crash! "Run!" Van shouted. "Run for the plane! We'll never make it now! Damn those bombers anyway!" All along the advancing front, the bombs were bursting, shattering the air with their detonations and scattering the glowing red stems and tendrils in all directions. The din was appalling, and the increasing brightness of the crimson glow added to the horror of the situation. Stumbling and cursing, they ran for the plane. "Fools! Fools!" Bill was shouting. "Can't they see the field and the plane? Why in the devil are they dropping them so near?" Then Bart was down, clawing at a 3-foot length of red tendril that had fallen on him and borne him to the earth. "Bart! Bart!" Van turned back and was tearing at the thing with fingers that were slippery with the sap that oozed from its torn skin. Monstrous earthworms. Cut them apart, and each portion lived on, took on new vigor. And these vile things could sting like a jellyfish. Where each sucker touched the skin, a burning sore remained. Bill helped them break away from the thing, and all three fought on toward the lights of the landing field. Only a short way off now. It seemed they would never reach it. The bombers were dropping their missiles with unceasing regularity, and the red death only spread the faster. When they scrambled into the cabin of the plane, the red wall of creeping horror was almost upon them. Advancing speedily out from the red-lit darkness, it seemed to halt momentarily, when it emerged into the brilliance of the great arc lights which illuminated the field. Then, more slowly and with seemingly purposeful deliberation, the wriggling feelers reached out from the mass and bore down upon them. Bill slammed the door and latched it, then fumbled frantically with the starter switch. A most welcome sound was the answering roar of the motor. The pilot yanked his ship into the air, taking off with the wind rather than running the risk of remaining on the ground long enough to taxi around and head into it. The plane acted like a frightened bird as Bill struggled with the controls, darting this way and that, and once missing a crash by inches as the tail was lifted by the treacherous ground wind. Then they were clear, and slowly gained altitude in a steep climb. "Whew!" Van exclaimed, mopping his red-splattered forehead with his handkerchief. "That was a narrow squeak, boys, and we haven't got the seeds yet, unless we can find a few in our clothing." "Who said so?" Bart gloated. "Look at this." He opened his clenched fist and disclosed one of the pods, unbroken and gleaming horribly scarlet in the dim light of the cabin. Bill heaved a sigh of relief as he banked the ship and swung around toward the south. He had dreaded another landing near the sea of moonweed. Van chortled over their good fortune as he examined the mysterious pod. One good thing the bombers had done anyway. Blew one of these things into his friend's hands. Bart and the young pilot found themselves very much out of the picture when they reported with Van at the research building in Washington. The government had no use for them in this emergency. It was the scientist they wanted, and he was immediately rushed into conference with the heads of the Bureau. His two friends were left to shift for themselves, and they joined the crowds in the street. The name of Carl Vanderventer was on everyone's tongue. Cursing and reviling him they were, for the hair-brained experiment which had been the cause of the terrible disaster. Fools! Bart seethed with rage and nearly came to blows with a number of vociferous agitators who were advocating a necktie party. Why hadn't the officials published the entire story as Van told it over the Secret Service radio? There was no mention of Dan Kelly in the broadcast news, nor of the fact that the police were searching for him in every city and town in the country. Another instance of the results of secrecy in governmental activities. "We'd better find ourselves a room and turn in," Bart growled. "Let's get out of this mob before I slam somebody." Bill Peterson was only too willing. He was suddenly very tired. In the Willard Hotel, they were assigned to an excellent room, and Bart insisted on switching on the broadcasts and listening to the news. Far into the night he sat by the loudspeaker, or paced the floor as an exceptionally calamitous happening was reported. But Bill slept through it all. The Army bombers had been recalled. Their efforts had worked more harm than good. The invincible moonweed had now crossed the Hudson River at Nyack and Piermont. Tarrytown was overrun, and many of the inhabitants had lost their lives, either in the maws of the insatiable monsters or in the panics and rioting that accompanied the evacuation of the town. New Jersey was covered as far south as New Brunswick and west to Phillipsburg and Belvedere. At Mauch Chunk, the contents of 20 oil tanks had been diverted to the Delaware River, and the floating oil film was proving at least a temporary protection to a considerable portion of the state of Pennsylvania. In New York State, the growth had buried hill and valley, town and village, as far as Monticello, and along the Hudson extended as far north as Kingston. At Poughkeepsie, on the opposite side of the river, frantic householders had armed themselves with rifles and shotguns, and were killing off all refugees who attempted to land from boats at that point. But the militia was on guard at the bridges, assuring safe crossing to the thousands who fled the Red Death over these routes. There was no keeping the seed of the moonweed from finding its way east. At some points, fire had been used with considerable success as a barrier, hundreds of acres of forest lands being destroyed in the endeavor to stem the crimson tide. But after the ashes were cool, germination would recur, and the weed would continue on its triumphant way. Acid sprays and poison gas of various kinds had been tried without appreciable effect. The casualty estimates already ran into the tens of thousands. Rumor had it that nearly 100,000 had lost their lives in the city of Newark alone. There was no way in which the figures could be checked while everything was in a state of confusion. Communication lines were broken, roads blocked, gas and electric supply systems paralyzed, and the railroads helpless. Trains could not be driven through the glutinous, wriggling mass that piled high on the tracks. Only the radio and the airlines were operative in the stricken area, and even these were of little value to the unfortunates who, in many cases, were surrounded and cut off from all hope of succor. At 4 a.m, with aching heart and reeling brain, Bart threw himself on the bed without undressing and fell into the troubled sleep of exhaustion and despair. The next day brought no encouragement, though it was reported that the growth developed with less rapidity after sunrise than it had during the night. Bart endeavored to get Van on the telephone, but was curtly informed by the operator at the research building that no incoming calls could be transferred to the laboratory where he was working. Knowing his friend, he pictured him as working feverishly with the government engineers and giving no thought to sleep or food. He'd kill himself, sure. But such a death even was preferable to the red one of the moonweed. The Canadians and Mexicans had been quick to protect their borders and forbid the landing of any American aircraft or the passage of trains and automobiles. But the seed had reached Europe, one of the 12-hour night airliners having carried 1,000 refugees who had sufficient foresight and the means to engage passage. It was a world catastrophe they faced. By mid-afternoon, the streets of Washington were almost deserted. It was less than 24 hours since the first moonseed took root, and already the crimson growth had progressed nearly 100 miles southward from the point of origin. Another 20 or 30 hours, and it would reach the capital city, unless Van and those engineers over in the research building discovered something, a miracle. Bart tried the telephone once more, and was overjoyed when the operator, all apologies now, informed him that Van had been trying to reach him for several hours. "Listen, old man," his friend's voice came over the wire. "I've been worried as the devil not knowing where you were. I want you and Bill to stick around where I can get you at any time. I may need you. Where are you staying?" "The Willard. Have you doped out something?" Bart answered in quick excitement. "Maybe. Can't let anything out yet, not till we've tested it thoroughly. But I can tell you that 100 factories are already working on machines we've devised. By good luck, it only means minor changes to an apparatus that is on the market in large quantity." "Great stuff. The city's nearly emptied itself, you know, and boy, how have they been razzing you over the radio and in the papers, howling for your hide, the whole country." "I know." Van's voice was calm, but Bart sensed in it something of a cold fury that was new to him in his friend. The young scientist was bitterly resentful of the attitude of the public. "Can we see you, Van?" "No, nor call me either. Better hang around the hotel and wait for a call from me. So long now, Bart. I've got to get busy." "So long." Bart gazed solemnly at Bill Peterson, who had been listening abstractedly to the one-sided conversation. Bill had given up hope and was resigned to the inevitable. "Says he may need us, Bill," said Bart. "Yeah? Well, we'll be ready for anything he wants us to do. It's no use, though, anything." "What do you mean, no use? You never saw Van licked yet, did you?" "Sure I did, by his super telescopes and the rocket ship. But this is different." Bart was a staunch defender of his friend. He glared at Bill for a moment and then switched on the news broadcast, which he knew he detested. The progress of the moonweed continued unabated. In the city of New York, 1 million souls were reported as having lost their lives, and this in spite of the difficulty experienced by the uncanny moonweed in obtaining a foothold in Manhattan. It had been thought that the asphalt and concrete would prove an effective barrier, and so they did for a time. But with the seed active in the parks and along the waterfronts, it was not long before the powerful roots of the greedy plants worked their way underneath, ripping up pavements and wriggling into cellars as they progressed. The city was a mass of wreckage and a maelstrom of fighting, dying humanity. Whole regiments of the National Guard were wiped out as they fought off the weed with axe and bayonet, in the effort to provide time for the refugees to clear from their homes in certain localities. All transportation facilities to the south and west were taxed to the utmost. There was fighting and killing for the possession of automobiles and planes and for room in trains and buses. Airline terminals and railroad stations were the scenes of dreadful massacres as the police and military guards fought off the crazed and desperate creatures who attacked them en masse. And still the news announcers prated of the responsibility of one Carl Vanderventer. The telephone bell rang, and Bart answered it for relief. At last they were to see some action. But no, it was merely the desk clerk, notifying him that all employees were leaving the hotel and that they would be left to shift for themselves. Yes, there was plenty of food in the kitchens. They were welcome to it. And a permanent telephone connection would be made to their room. The frightened clerk wished them luck. In endless monotone, the voice of the news announcer droned on. Binghamton and Elmira, Albany and Schenectady, New Haven, Philadelphia, Allentown, all had succumbed. The casualty estimates now ran into the millions. The mist, the red mist that rose from the steaming weed, was drifting westward and spreading the seed with ever-increasing rapidity. For now, the monstrous growth from out the sky was adapting itself to its environment, providing the seed with feathery tufts that permitted the winds to carry them far and wide, like the seed of a dandelion. "Turn off that damn thing!" Bill shouted, and he jumped to his feet, his eyes glinting strangely in the twilight gloom of the room. Bill was close to the breaking point. "Guess you're right," Bart mumbled. "No good for either of us to listen to that stuff." He switched off the receiver, and they sat in silence as darkness fell over the city. Bill shivered and felt for the button of the electric light, which he pressed with a trembling finger. They blinked in the sudden illumination, but it cheered them somewhat. It was not good to sit in the darkness and think. Besides, they knew that the turbine generators of Potomac Edison were still running. Some brave souls were sticking to their jobs, for a time at least. "God," Bill suddenly groaned after an endless time of dead silence. "My sister lives in Pittsburgh, you know. Wonder if she and the kids got away. It won't be long before the damn stuff gets there." Bart thanked his lucky stars that he had no family ties. "Oh, they had plenty of warning," he tried to console Bill. "Hours, you know, and the westbound lines are in good shape from there. I wouldn't worry about them if I were you." There was utter silence once more. Even the customary street noises was lacking. Both men jumped nervously when the shrill siren of a police motorcycle sounded in the distance. Bart thought grimly of his fracas with the officer who had tried to arrest Van. How long ago that seemed, and how inconsequential an incident. Their windows faced north, and by midnight they could make out the red glow of the moonweed, that awful band of flickering crimson that painted the horizon the color of blood. The telephone clamored for attention, and Bill stifled a hysterical sob as the terrifying sound broke the eerie stillness. Van was on the way to get them. He had a government car, and they were to go to Arlington for Bill's plane. Then what? He refused to commit himself. They must follow him blindly. Anything was better than this inactivity, though. Bart shouted with glee. "We're going north," Van replied shortly in answer to Bart's question when they entered the official car in front of the hotel. "After Dan Kelly." "After Dan Kelly? Got a line on him?" "Yes. Secret Service reports him in Toronto. The Canucks are after him now, but, by God, I'm going to get him myself." Van was haggard and wan, his eyes gleaming with a fanatical light. The strain had done something to him, something Bart didn't like at all. This was a different Van from the man who had entered his office 2 days previously. Unshaven and unkempt, he looked and talked like a drunken man on the verge of delirium tremens. "What's the idea, Van?" he asked gently. "I'm going to get him. I tell you, the scum. It's his fault the whole world's against me. I'll get him, Bart. I'll kill him with my bare hands." So that was it. The combination of grueling labor in the effort to save mankind from the dread moonweed and bitter censure from the very people he was trying to save had been too much for Van. He had developed a fixation, unreasoning and murderous. He'd get even with the man who had caused the trouble, and nothing could deter him from his purpose. Bart could see that. Might as well humor him and help him. It made little difference anyway, with the red doom spreading at its present rate. They'd all be victims in a few days. They were speeding through the streets of Washington at a breakneck rate. Van bent over the wheel and like a demented man glued his wildly staring eyes to the road. "What about your work?" Bart asked after a while. "Has anything been accomplished?" "Yes and no. They'll be ready to shoot in a few hours. Don't know whether it'll be a complete success or not, but I sneaked away anyhow. This other thing's more important to me right now." "What's the dope? Can you tell us now?" "Sure. I've got one of the machines in the car, and I'll explain when we're on our way to Canada." This wasn't like Van. Never secretive and always in good humor, he was treating his friends like annoying strangers. "You can't land in Canada," Bill ventured as they pulled up at the gate of the airport. "Like hell I can't. You watch my smoke, and let any bloody Canuck up there try and stop me." He was lifting a small black case from the luggage carrier of the car as he replied. Bart silenced the airman with a look. When they had taken off and were well under way, Van opened his black case and set a vacuum tube apparatus in operation. They were nearing the fringe of the glowing sea of red that was the vast blanket of moonweed. It now extended to within a few miles of Baltimore and stretched northward as far as the eye could see. "It was a cinch," Van was explaining. "When I first saw that the growth slowed up under the arc lights at Tompkins Cave, it gave me the glimmering of an idea. Then, on the following day, when we learned that the weed spread more slowly in sunlight, I was convinced. The stuff is dormant on the moon, you know." "Why?" Bart asked breathlessly. "Because there is no atmosphere surrounding the moon, and the sun's rays are not filtered before they reach its surface as they are here. The invisible rays, ultraviolet and such, are present in full proportion, and the moonweed cannot flourish when subjected to light of the higher frequencies. It died out when the moon lost its atmosphere, and only revived on being brought to Earth, probably 1,000,000 times more prolific in our dense and damp atmosphere and rich soil. The thing's a cinch to dope out." "Yeah," Bart commented dryly. Van was now talking, and he could have bitten off his tongue for interrupting him. This machine of Van's was a generator of invisible light in the ultra-indigo range, Van explained. You couldn't see its powerful beam, but they had proved in the laboratory that it was certain doom to the moonweed. They had grown the stuff from seed in steel cages and played with it until they were all satisfied. Now would come the final test. 10,000 planes were being equipped with the new generator, which was merely an adaptation of standard directional television transmitters, and tonight these would start out to fight the weed. It was a cinch. Beneath them, the red cauldron seethed and tossed as they sped northward. The crimson blanket of death was steadily covering the country. "Drop to 1,000 feet, Bill," the scientist called, "and then watch below. But don't slow down. We've got to get to Toronto." The ship nosed down and soon leveled off at the prescribed altitude. Van's vacuum tubes lighted to full brilliancy, and a black spot appeared on the glowing surface just beneath them, a black spot that extended into a streak as the plane continued on its way. They were cutting a swath of blackness 50 feet wide through the heart of the growth. "See that?" Van gloated. "It's killing them by the millions. And the best of it is the effect it leaves behind. The soil is permeated to a depth of several inches, and the stuff will not germinate in the spots where the ray has contacted. Oh, it works to perfection." Bill was exuberant. His hopes revived miraculously. He gave his motor the gun and got out of it every last revolution that it could turn up. He must get Van to Canada. Not such a bad idea, this going after Kelly at that. Bart was voluble in his praise, then caught himself short as he remembered that he had doubted Van but a half-hour previously. Doubted him and despaired. Now Van, lapsing into gloomy silence after his triumph, was again thinking of nothing but revenge. The getting of Dan Kelly meant more to him now than the extinction of the moonweed. When they landed at the Toronto airport, they were welcomed with open arms instead of with rifle fire as Bill had anticipated. The news had gone forth. Already 1,000 planes flying over the United States were driving back the sea of destruction. The invisible ray was a success, and the name of Carl Vanderventer was now a thing with which to conjure, rather than one on which to heap imprecation and insult. Van grimaced wryly at this last bit of news. Dan Kelly? No one at the airport had ever heard of him. Van telephoned into the city, to police headquarters. Yes, they had apprehended the fugitive American at the request of Washington, but he was a slippery customer. He had escaped. Van raged and fumed. Of what use were the congratulations of the night flyers who still loitered in the hangar? Of what consolation the radio reports of the success of the ultra-indigo ray in the States and in Europe? He had come after his man, and he'd failed. Defeat was a bitter pill. The news broadcasts from the States were jubilant and became increasingly so during the night. The moonweed was being driven back on a wide front, and by morning would be entirely surrounded. There would be no further loss of life and little more destruction of property. Carl Vanderventer had saved the day. Van grunted his disgust whenever an announcer mentioned his name. When daylight came, they prepared to return. Little use there was of searching the highways and byways of Canada for the fugitive. He'd simply have to wait until the Canadians were able to get a line on Dan Kelly again. It was maddening, but Bart was glad. The light of reason was returning to his friend's eyes in the reaction. Then there was a telephone call from the city for Van. Police headquarters wanted him. The fanatical glint returned to his eyes when he ran for the hangar to answer the call. Perhaps they had already captured Kelly. And he had an order in his pocket for the man's return to the States. He'd been made a deputy, and with Kelly released to him, anything might happen. Something would happen. But the police were reporting the unexplainable reappearance of the moonweed just outside the city limits at a point near Cooksville. Would Mr. Vanderventer be so kind as to fly over there and destroy it before any lives were lost? He would. The growth had covered an acre of ground by the time they reached the spot designated. But it was the work of only a minute to blast it out of existence with the ultra-indigo ray. Van surveyed the blackened and shriveled mass with satisfaction. "Let's land and take a look at it," he said. Bart thought he saw a look of exultation flash over his careworn features. Soon they were wading deep in the blackened remains of the moonweed. The stems and tendrils snapped and crumbled into powder as they passed through. The stuff was done for, no question of that. Bill Peterson yelled and pointed a shaking forefinger at an object that lay in the blackened ruin. It was a human skeleton, the bones bare of flesh and gleaming white in the light of the early morning sun. Van was on his knees, quick as a flash, feeling around the gruesome thing, pawing at the shreds of clothing that remained. Then he was on his feet, his face shining with unholy glee. In his hands were a half-dozen small, smooth objects which looked like pebbles. The diamonds. "I thought so," he exclaimed. "It's Kelly. Only way the seed could have gotten up here. He had some on his clothes and didn't know it. I couldn't get him myself, but anyway, I'm satisfied." He staggered and would have fallen had not Bart caught him in his arms. Poor old Van. Nearly killed him, this thing had, but he'd be himself again after it was all over. No wonder he'd gone out of his head with the horror of it and the blame that had been so cruelly laid on him. No wonder he'd become obsessed with this idea of getting square with Dan Kelly. But now he was content, sleeping like a babe in Bart's arms. Tenderly, they carried him to the plane and laid him out on the cushions in back. They'd let him sleep as long as he could, return him to Washington, where he'd receive his just dues in recognition for his services. Then would follow the work of reconstruction and rehabilitation. Van would glory in that. Bart regarded his sleeping friend thoughtfully as they winged their swift way toward the American border. The harsh lines that had showed in his face during the past few hours were smoothed away, and in their place was an expression of deep contentment. He was at peace with the world once more. Good old Van. What a difference there would be when he awakened to full realization of the changed order of things. What a satisfaction and relief.
Actually, that was a pretty good story. Keep in mind that it was first published in 1931. I'm left to wonder how many modern-day stories this tale inspired. How about a 1955 classic book and movie called Invasion of the Body Snatchers, for one? Harl Vincent was the author of Moonweed. His real name was Harl Vincent Schafflin. He was an American mechanical engineer and science fiction writer. He was published regularly in the science fiction pulp mags of the era. He was born in 1893 and passed away in 1968. I found a couple more of his stories, and I hope to get them on the show. Growing up. We've all had to do it, or at least are trying to work on it. Some of us may never really accomplish it, and for others it is fading away too soon. Tom Williams? Well, he's a lucky man. He lives in Berlin, Germany, was raised in Alabama, and sends in these tales from his youth. On Growing Up this time, Tom reminds us about the simple things in life in a story he calls Growing Up and
The Simple Things of Life. It is strange how small things spur childhood memories. For example, the other day, I was at a fast food restaurant when I noticed how large these portions were that people were ordering, not for the whole family, but for each, even the tiny children. This reminded me of times when I would go into town, spend the weekend with my Aunt Annie, and babysit her daughter, my little cousin Terry. She enjoyed watching the 9-inch black and white TV with poor reception because of those simple rabbit ear antennas. The big treat for us was going to a fast food restaurant on the corner and order a hamburger. Yes, just one hamburger. I can't remember how much the hamburger cost those days, probably around 30 cents. We couldn't afford more than that one hamburger, and of course, no soft drink nor French fries. We would rush home with the one hamburger where we could cut it into 2 pieces for each of us to share. We savored every tiny morsel of that half hamburger as if it were our last. It was a banquet for the 2 of us. There was another bit of sharing between Terry and I. Pickles. Yes, dill pickles. At the grocery store, we would purchase from the cooler a single bag containing a dill pickle in the juice for a dime. Terry and I would rush back to the apartment and cut open the bag, and we divided the dill pickle between the 2 of us. It was as if it were caviar. After the treat, then came the best part, each drinking the rest of the pickle juice. Then we sat back in the 2 rocking chairs on the balcony in full delight. All was right with the world. Many years later, as adults, we met as she was visiting her mom in Ohio, We were in a grocery store and got the same idea again. We purchased, not pickle, but we purchased a can of smoked octopus and 1 beer. Oh yes, we could have afforded more, but that wasn't the point. The point was sharing. We went down to the small river, to the bank, picked out a shaded area and large boulders to sit on, and opened both containers, and each had, once again, shared half and half. The memories came flooding back. Ah, the simple things of life. Sincerely, Tom.
That was so very true, Tom. This time your story made me sit down for a moment and think of such a time. We have a professional basketball team close by. I'm sure that you've at least heard of the Portland Trail Blazers. They've been here since 1970, and next season will be their 50th year. One of the best memories I have is my brother taking me to those early games. They were not very good, but being there with my brother and watching those guys do their very best inspired me. Not to mention the fact that that was one thing that my brother and I did together. Another one? Well, that was James Bond movies, but that is another story. Thank you, Tom. We now close this podcast with my thanks to Mr. Harry Ball, Earl Patrick Ross, Sir Mark Nelson, and Der Baron von Berlin, Tom Williams. I wave my hand in your general direction. If you want to follow the podcast or the blog, just head to ronsamazingstories.com. There you'll find an amazing number of links that should fit every need. Do you want to help the show? The best thing you can do is to tell your friends about it. And please leave reviews or feedback wherever you listen. This really does help us to grow. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come again to find out what are Ron's Amazing Stories.
All of the vintage audio used in the podcast is believed to be in the public domain. Ron's Amazing Stories does not own the rights to any of the old-time radio used here. If you hold the rights to any of the shows played, please contact us immediately at ronsamazingstories.com.